The Sol system had been silent for so long that most believed it dead. Among the sprawling archives of the Galactic Council, Earth was nothing more than a faded entry. Quarantine Zone 042. Human species. Classification unstable. Access forbidden. No one truly remembered the reasons anymore. The files were sealed, buried under centuries of political dust and fear. Over time, the myths grew. Young diplomats whispered about a wild race that burned brighter and faster than any species before them. Soldiers joked that if humans still existed, they were probably throwing rocks at each other somewhere. Scientists speculated that Earth's own reckless nature must have consumed it long ago. Humanity had simply become a ghost story, a warning about what happened when a species evolved too quickly without control. On the rare occasions someone suggested investigating, the Council would quickly shut them down. Why waste resources? The Sol system was marked dangerous for a reason. Best to leave ancient dangers buried. But Earth was not silent. Not really. Beneath the blue oceans and green forests, something had been stirring. Humanity had never perished. They had never fallen into chaos, never truly turned their back on the stars. They had waited. Far below the notice of the Galactic Council, humans had torn down their own ruins and built anew. They had clawed their way through centuries of wars, disasters, and setbacks. They had forged alliances among themselves that no outsider could have predicted. No longer fractured, no longer reckless, humanity had become something more. The only mistake the Council made was assuming that silence meant weakness. In reality, it meant focus. It meant evolution. As the galaxy spun on, oblivious, humanity was preparing. Cities stretched beyond Earth's atmosphere, clinging to the sky like shining spiderwebs. Great forges burned on the surface of Mars. Shipyards floated among the moons of Jupiter. 1,000 projects, once thought impossible even by human standards, thrived in the shadows of forgotten space. No signal, no warning, no desperate plea for inclusion came from Earth. Only the quiet hum of progress, the sharpening of a blade unseen. And then, one day, without ceremony, a signal left Earth. A pure, unfiltered pulse that traveled across the void faster than anything the Council had prepared for. It was not cloaked. It was not hidden. It was meant to be heard. Across distant systems, satellites screamed to life. Receivers crackled and sparked. Holographic displays in council chambers flickered with a simple, chilling message. Humanity returns. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. On the high towers of the galactic capital, where ambassadors from 100 worlds met, fear rippled through the air like a gathering storm. The quarantine had failed. The ghost story had become real. And no one, not even the wisest among them, knew what would come next. The signal was short. Just 2 words, yet they hit with the force of a supernova. Humanity returns. Across the galaxy, governments scrambled. Emergency meetings were called in the dead of night. Admirals barked orders into comms that had not been used in centuries. Scholars pored over ancient records, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The Galactic Council, usually a place of calm and careful diplomacy, exploded into chaos. Delegates shouted over each other in 100 different languages. Holographic screens floated around the council chambers, replaying the message again and again. It was simple, it was direct, and it was terrifying. The problem was not the message itself. It was who had sent it. Humanity was not supposed to exist anymore, at least not in any meaningful way. They were supposed to be isolated, broken, left to fade into myth. The quarantine zone had been one of the Council's first and greatest acts of unity. Entire fleets had once stood guard around Sol. Entire policies had been shaped around the fear of what humans could become. And yet, here they were, broadcasting their presence to the stars without hesitation, without fear. Panic settled deep into the Council's bones. No one knew how much time they had. Was it a message of peace? A warning? A declaration of war? No one could tell. Humans had always been unpredictable. That was why they had been sealed away in the first place. Too adaptable, too aggressive, too willing to change themselves and their surroundings to survive. A special emergency session was called, the first in 3 centuries. The ancient hall, carved into the living crystal of the Council's central world, filled with leaders, scholars, and military commanders. Some argued to respond immediately, to show strength. Others pleaded for caution, afraid of provoking the species they barely understood anymore. In the end, one decision was made, agreed upon by trembling hands and uneasy glances. They would send a stealth fleet, not to attack, not yet, to observe, to understand. The fleet would enter the Sol system silently, hidden under layers of cloaking technology and jamming fields. Their mission was simple: find out what humanity had become. Find out if the old fears still had teeth. Within hours, sleek black ships vanished into slip space, bound for Earth. The Council waited, their collective breath held tight, as the scouts sped toward the heart of the Forgotten Zone. Across the stars, the common people whispered. News of the signal leaked despite desperate attempts to control it. Some saw hope, a lost sibling race returning to the galactic family. Others saw doom, a predator stirring after a long, patient slumber. In the cold silence of deep space, the stealth fleet traveled onward, unaware that humanity had seen them coming long before they ever arrived. The stealth fleet moved quietly through the void, its black hulls barely visible against the backdrop of space. The ships were equipped with the most advanced cloaking technology the galaxy had ever seen. The Council had spared no expense. They knew the importance of this mission. No one could afford to underestimate the re-emergence of humanity. At first, there was nothing. The Sol system seemed as quiet as any other, distant stars twinkling, the occasional asteroid belt drifting between planets. Earth was a small blue and green world, nestled among its neighbors, still and unthreatening. But as they got closer, the first hints of change began to surface. The scout ships detected faint signals coming from Earth's surface, erratic transmissions not unlike old Earth broadcasts from centuries ago. As they pushed deeper into the system, more signs emerged. Jupiter's moons, once lifeless, now glittered with artificial lights. The scout ship's sensors picked up strange energy signatures from Ganymede and Callisto, signals of massive construction activity. Far beyond where humanity had once dared, the humans had built. The fleet's commander, Captain Alora, glanced nervously at the data pouring in. Her orders had been simple: gather intel, do not engage. But every reading they picked up made her doubt their mission. The humans were still here, still alive, and somehow, they had not only survived but thrived. Finally, the scout ships came to the edge of the asteroid belt that surrounded Earth. Captain Alora ordered her fleet to pause, the black ships drifting silently, concealed by the darkness of the belt. They had expected the humans to be primitive, perhaps hiding in the wreckage of their past. What they saw instead nearly shattered that assumption. In low orbit around Earth, massive shipyards were under construction, and colossal ships floated like giants, their immense frames being pieced together by fleets of drones. The scouts' sensors detected defensive structures surrounding the planet, weapons systems powerful enough to make the most advanced Council armament look like child's play. By the stars, murmured Lieutenant Derek, the youngest member of the fleet, unable to hide his amazement. They're building fleets, entire fleets. Captain Alora's eyes narrowed. This is no accident. They've known we'd come. The realization hit them hard. The humans had been waiting. They had prepared for this moment. It wasn't the first time they'd felt the eyes of the galaxy upon them. Perhaps it was the reason they had kept themselves hidden for so long, knowing that one day the stars would stir and the Council would come. Alora made a decision. The fleet would remain hidden for now, observing until they could confirm what humanity had become. But one thing was clear. Earth was not the broken, primitive world the Council had believed. It had become something much more dangerous. The humans were not merely survivors. They had reinvented themselves, And as the fleet retreated back into the shadows of the belt, Captain Allura couldn't shake the feeling that this mission, this quiet observation, was the calm before the storm. The scouts continued their silent vigil as they circled the Sol system, their task far from complete. In the distance, the lights of Earth gleamed brightly, a warning that the galaxy was about to change in ways no one had anticipated. Back on the capital world of the Galactic Council, leaders gathered in secret. The scouts had returned with unsettling reports, and the full extent of humanity's resurgence was beginning to surface. But despite the urgent meetings, there were still many questions. What had happened to the humans? Why had they been sealed away in the first place? In the deepest vaults of the Council archives, a small group of historians and researchers began to search for answers. They scored files that had been long locked away, only accessible to the highest-ranking officials. Slowly, the veil of secrecy was lifted, revealing a history that the Council had long sought to forget. The records painted a picture of a species unlike any other. Humanity, in its early days, had been incredibly resourceful, perhaps too much so. Thousands of years ago, they had begun to spread across their home planet, building civilizations, waging wars, and rapidly advancing their technology. The first signs of trouble had come when humanity began to unlock the secrets of space travel. What had once been seen as a hopeful future quickly turned to fear. Humanity had begun exploring the stars, sending out colonies to nearby planets. But there was something about them, something that terrified the other species of the galaxy. Humans were unrelenting. They didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't worry about the consequences of their actions. When their first interstellar ships reached other worlds, they didn't come in peace. They came with ambition, taking whatever they needed to fuel their expansion. The Council had watched with growing concern as humanity moved from one system to the next. They had made alliances, yes, but they had also taken worlds by force. They had conquered alien races in ways that were brutal and efficient, using their sheer willpower to overcome anything that stood in their way. But it wasn't just their military power that had worried the Council. It was their ability to adapt. Humans were fast learners, able to integrate new technologies into their own in record time. They had a thirst for innovation that was unmatched. The galaxy wasn't prepared for a species that could evolve and adapt as quickly as they did. So the decision had been made. The quarantine zone had been established. A fleet of ships was dispatched to lock down the Sol system, cutting humanity off from the stars. The Council had hoped that isolation would stunt their progress. They had been wrong. The humans had adapted to their confinement, using it as an opportunity to focus on their own development. They had learned to survive without interference, and in doing so, they had grown stronger than anyone could have predicted. The Council had assumed that humanity would fade into irrelevance over the centuries. But as the scouts had discovered, the humans had instead used their time wisely. They had built ships, developed weapons, and established a power base far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The quarantine hadn't worked. And now, as the galaxy watched, humanity was emerging from the shadows, stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than ever. A decision had been made. The Council, despite their fears and uncertainty, would try to open diplomatic talks with humanity. An envoy was quickly assembled, a small fleet, selected for its experience in delicate negotiations and high-stakes diplomacy. The representatives of various galactic species, each with their own unique interests, anxiously prepared for the mission. Despite the looming threat of humanity's unexpected strength, the Council had agreed that diplomacy was their only remaining option. If humanity could truly control such vast resources and military power, an open conflict could obliterate everything they had worked to build for centuries. But if they could be convinced to cooperate, if they could be brought into the fold, they might become powerful allies. The fleet was sent, silent and swift, a shadow in the dark void of space. As it neared Earth, the representatives rehearsed their lines, exchanging pleasantries and practiced speeches in anticipation of the encounter. They had no idea what to expect from the humans, but they hoped it would be civil, if not respectful, then at least measured. After all, this was the first contact in over a millennium, and the Council's reputation was on the line. They emerged from the final layer of the Sol system's asteroid belt, and before them, Earth lay in all its technicolor glory. For the first time, they saw the full extent of humanity's power. Gigantic orbital stations, powerful starships in construction, and swarms of drones filling the sky like locusts. The fleet slowed its approach, entering Earth's atmosphere with the delicate care of a visitor to a foreign world. The human ships hovering above were a far cry from the primitive vessels the Council had once anticipated. No longer were they makeshift crafts or aging warships. These ships were sleek, purposeful, and formidable, built for a future that stretched far beyond Earth itself. When the human diplomats appeared, they were not cowering in awe or trembling with fear. They were calm, composed, and confident, stepping forward as equals, or perhaps more than equals, in the eyes of the Council. They did not extend open hands in greeting. They did not offer gifts or promises of peace. Instead, they stood tall, silent, waiting for the Council to speak. The Council's diplomats were taken aback. The humans had already anticipated their arrival, and it was clear they were not here to negotiate from a position of weakness. They had been waiting for this moment, prepared for the Council's attempt to regain control over them. Their eyes were sharp, their voices calm but firm. The human leader, a woman named Alex Harper, spoke first. Her words, though simple, carried weight. "We have not come to beg. We have not come to surrender. We've come to offer partnership, nothing more, nothing less." Her words echoed through the vast chamber of the Council's flagship, and a tense silence followed. The Council members exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. They had expected submission, or at least a plea for mercy. Instead, they were confronted with a race that had learned not to ask, but to demand. For a moment, no one spoke. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of this new reality. Humanity had not come to rejoin the galaxy as a humble participant. They had come to take their place among the stars, not as subordinates, but as equals, perhaps something more. The Council delegates were still reeling from the human envoy's bold statement, but the meeting continued. Alex Harper stood tall at the front of the Council chamber, flanked by a few of her most trusted officers. Her gaze was unwavering, yet calm. She was not here to appease or negotiate for the smallest of concessions. She was here to set the terms of the future. It was clear now that humanity had something the galaxy had not anticipated. Power, not just in the form of weapons or technology, but a different kind of power, one that stemmed from unity, vision, and an unyielding drive to succeed. For centuries, the galaxy had relied on diplomacy, alliances, and influence to maintain order. Humanity, it seemed, had learned something the Council hadn't: how to move beyond the petty squabbles and divisions that plagued most species. "We've learned," Alex began, her voice resonating with authority, "that survival is not just about strength. It's about adaptation, about changing when change is necessary. We are no longer the fractured, warring species you remember. We have learned to unify, and we have learned to evolve." Her words lingered in the Council chamber, stirring unease in some delegates and curiosity in others. The delegation of the United Human Nations had been working for centuries toward this moment. From the ashes of their fractured past, they had created a singular identity, an identity that sought not only survival, but dominance in an ever-changing universe. Alex stepped forward, clicking a small device in her hand. A holographic display flickered to life above the conference table, showing images of Earth's most recent advancements: ships the size of moons, cities in the clouds, colonies on Mars that had flourished with their own ecosystems, all maintained by self-sustaining technologies. "We do not just survive," Alex continued. "We innovate. We push the limits of what's possible. Our technology has surpassed the old borders of space. We've learned to harness quantum entanglement for communication, to create energy weapons that rival your finest defenses. And our fleets. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Our fleets are just the beginning. The council members looked to one another, some unsettled by the display, others intrigued. Humanity had always been the wild card, but now it was clear. They were no longer the outcasts of the galaxy. They had become something far more formidable. Commander Talon, a military strategist from one of the most war-hardened species in the council, stood up. His eyes, sharp and calculating, regarded Alex with a mix of respect and wariness. You speak of innovation. You speak of unity. But what of the cost? What happens when a species evolves so quickly that it loses its place in the galaxy's delicate balance? How do you ensure that power does not corrupt you? Alex met his gaze, unwavering. We have learned our lessons. We understand what happens when a species becomes reckless. But we have also learned what happens when you wait too long to act. She let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Our rise was not an accident. We have been patient, but we have also been building for a future where we do not just survive, but thrive. The council members exchanged uncertain glances. The reality was now undeniable. Humanity had moved beyond what they had expected. They were not merely looking for a seat at the table. They were bringing their own table, and they intended to set the terms of the galaxy's future. As the meeting continued, it was clear that humanity's power was not just in their technology, but in their resolve. They had changed the game, and the council would have to adapt, or risk being left behind. The council chamber had never felt so tense. The delegates, once so confident in their positions, now found themselves second-guessing every decision they had ever made. Humanity was no longer a myth or a forgotten relic. They were here. They had returned, and they had come with a power and purpose that no one had anticipated. The galaxy's leaders were divided. Some, like the ambassador from the Varnac system, argued for immediate diplomacy. They should extend the olive branch, make peace, and seek to integrate humanity into the galactic community. The Varnac had always been a peaceful people, believing that unity and cooperation were the only ways forward. But others, like General Kor, a cold and calculating strategist from the Tellarith, were not so easily convinced. "We've underestimated them once," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We cannot afford to make that mistake again. The humans have shown us their strength, their resolve. If we do not act swiftly, we risk losing everything." There was fear in his words, a fear that was spreading through the council like a virus. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what humanity's rise meant for the balance of power. But Alex Harper had been watching. She could sense the shift in the room, the way the council's unified front was beginning to fracture. She had expected some resistance, but the level of suspicion and fear was almost palpable. Her voice cut through the growing murmurs like a blade. "You're right to be cautious, but the real question is not whether we are a threat to you. The question is whether you will adapt, or if you will be left behind." Her words were sharp, her tone unyielding. She knew that the galaxy's leaders were afraid, and she was making it clear that the time for hesitation was over. The council's hesitation was understandable. The humans had always been a wild card, unpredictable, quick to act, and eager to push the boundaries of what was possible. In the past, their willingness to take risks had often led them to victory, but it had also made them dangerous. The galaxy had learned to fear their aggression, their drive to conquer, and their remarkable ability to adapt to any challenge. And now, humanity was offering partnership, a chance to stand side by side with the galaxy's other species, to forge an alliance that would reshape the stars. But the question remained, was it a partnership based on trust, or was it a calculated move to secure their own dominance? The council was at a crossroads. General Kor's words echoed in the chamber, and his allies were growing in number. "We cannot let them dictate the future. If we do not act now, we may never have the chance again." But there were those who hesitated. The Xylar delegation, with their centuries of wisdom, argued that cooperation was the only way forward. They reminded the council that humanity's potential could be a force for good if guided by the right hand. but they were growing fewer in number as the fear began to spread. As the meeting dragged on, the galaxy's fate hung in the balance. One thing was clear: humanity had already begun to change the game. The Council could either embrace this new reality or they could fight it. But in doing so, they risked starting a war that none of them could afford to lose. Alex Harper knew the stakes. She had been patient, but now, the time for negotiation was over. The Council had to decide, and time was running out. The Council's chamber was thick with tension, the silence hanging heavier than ever before. Alex Harper's words had planted a seed of doubt among the delegates. There was no going back now. The question that lingered in the air was no longer whether humanity would accept the galaxy's terms. It was whether the galaxy could survive the terms humanity would set. As the minutes passed, the leaders shifted uncomfortably, unable to escape the gravity of the situation. On one side stood those who favored peace, wary of the catastrophic consequences of a war with humanity. On the other, the Hawks-like General Corps pressed for an immediate response. He believed that if they didn't act swiftly, the balance of power would irrevocably shift in humanity's favor. Alex stood before them all, unwavering, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had once considered humanity little more than a myth. Now those same faces were filled with fear, awe, and uncertainty. The stakes had been raised, and there was no way to undo what was unfolding. "Think carefully," Alex said, her voice cutting through the air. "You are not deciding just for yourselves or your individual species. You are deciding for the galaxy. Will you stand with us and shape the future, or will you resist and see it burn?" Her words struck deep. The threat was clear, but the choice was far from easy. The Council had been a symbol of unity for so long, a beacon of cooperation between countless species, but humanity's sudden emergence had shattered that unity. The galaxy had always feared what humanity could become, and now they were about to find out if those fears were justified. After what felt like an eternity, the Xyler delegation spoke up, their leader, Sthur, breaking the silence. "We have seen the rise of empires and their eventual fall. The question is not whether we fight or yield. The question is whether we allow the same mistakes to happen again. Humanity's drive to dominate is undeniable, but their vision for the future—" He paused, turning his gaze to the human delegation. "It's not one of destruction. It's one of transformation, and that is something we must not ignore." The words seemed to resonate with several of the more peace-minded delegates, but there were still those who believed humanity's ambitions could not be trusted. Tension rippled through the room, and General Corps' voice rose once more. "This is not a time for idealism. The humans are too unpredictable. Their ambition could lead to our undoing." Alex's expression remained calm as she faced the Council. "You fear us because you know what we are capable of. But we've never sought to destroy what we could build together. You see a predator in our rise. I see a partner in the making." The Council was on the verge of collapse. The decision was no longer abstract. It was about survival. If they refused to accept humanity's place among them, they would risk a war that would bring the galaxy to its knees. But if they chose to cooperate, they would have to accept that they were no longer the most powerful force in the stars. Humanity had already shown that it had the potential to dominate, but it also had the power to reshape the future in ways no one could predict. The chamber was still, the fate of the galaxy hanging on the edge of a blade. The next word spoken would decide everything.